Now we're moving to the session 2, macroeconomic and financial cooperation. I'd like to invite the chair and the speakers on that side. So, Malcolm Knight from CG, he's going to chair this session. And the lead speakers are Matthew Goodman from CSAS, Guillermo Wiesba from CFID, Sergei Drobovskaya from Gaidar Institute, Paula Morgi from ISPI, John Curtin from University of Toronto, and Mark Uzan from Preventing Bretton Woods.
Okay, I think we'll get started if you'll just come back from the back there. My name is Malcolm Knight, and this session is certainly on two interrelated areas that are very much within the purview and responsibilities that the G20 has taken on: macroeconomic cooperation and financial cooperation. Since the first session ran a little late, we will also run a little late, but I'm still going to ask each of the speakers to try to stick to speaking for no more than 10 minutes. No more than 10 minutes. In your initial interventions, there'll be lots of time to interact among yourselves and with the audience after each of your interventions. Let me just quickly set the stage here. On macroeconomic cooperation, we've had now 7 years of highly unorthodox, highly accommodative monetary policy in what I would call the G3. That's the reserve centers, the United States, the Eurozone, and Japan. And those policies, those monetary policies, have been seen as needed to make the employment problem that resulted from the crisis less serious than it otherwise would have been. We can all argue about how effective those policies have been. It would have been nice to be able to use fiscal policy to address that, but the fiscal conditions in most countries were such that fiscal policy really didn't have too much scope. So despite the fact that monetary policy is really not the most effective instrument to underpin unemployment, it has done that. It's required a very, very massive deviation from the standard techniques of monetary policy. Now we're in the process where it looks like, for example, the US economy will be able to begin to renormalize. The rate at which the other regions, Japan and the Eurozone, can renormalize will depend on how much their economies strengthen. And so the whole world and all of us are going to be very much influenced by what goes on. We can talk about the cooperation that needs to take place in those conditions, but basically this is a situation that's been created by events. It's part of the woodwork now. And markets are just going to have to cope with what is likely to be quite high volatility of markets over the next 2 or 3 years, particularly in the exchange markets, in interest rates, and probably in equities as well. I don't think there's particular fine-tuning that needs to be done around that, but I'd be interested to hear what the speakers may say. But there's another area which influences us all, where there's a fundamental, it seems to me, a fundamental inconsistency within the economic policies that are being pursued by the G20 countries. And that's the inconsistency between this hyper-accommodative monetary policy, which, as everyone knows, has created huge incentives to go out the risk curve, to reach for yield, and has affected pricing in fixed income markets, in equity markets, in other asset markets very strongly. And the initiatives in regulatory reform, which essentially have been directed at reducing or strengthening the risk management of the institutions at the core of the international financial system. So there's a bit of an inconsistency here in that monetary policy has had its foot totally on the accelerator pedal, and macro-prudential policy and prudential policies generally have had their foot on the brake. And this is an inconsistency which needs to be addressed going forward. It's been dictated by circumstances so far, but now it has to be regularized. And I think there is a fundamental question about how that will be done, and I think that real macro-prudential policy will be crucial to that. So I think those are two areas of macroeconomic and financial cooperation that I hope will come out in the course of this discussion, which should be very interesting. As I said, I'm going to ask each of the speakers initially to stick to 10 minutes. Matthew Goodman of CSIS, let me start with you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Guven and Tepav and all the youngsters who helped make this happen. Appreciate it. So I'm going to talk primarily about the macroeconomic side. I'll leave other experts to talk about the financial regulatory reform side of this debate. So macroeconomic cooperation is one of the core pillars of the G20. It's one of the three things that brought the G20 together in 2008 at the leaders level, along with financial regulatory reform and reform of the international financial architecture. And the summation of the G20 mission for macroeconomic cooperation is the statement that was agreed at the Pittsburgh summit in September 2009, that we will strive to achieve strong, sustainable, and balanced growth. And all three of those adjectives are deliberately chosen and important in its own right, and none of the three is happening right now. We don't have strong growth, we don't have sustainable growth, we don't have balanced growth. The IMF keeps lowering its forecasts for the global economy for GDP growth, and it's now roughly 3.5% this year and next. The growth is not balanced. If you look at the four big engines of the global economy in descending order of size, the European Union, the United States, China, and Japan. Only one of those four engines is actually firing, which is the United States, and the others are slowing or flat. And so we have tremendous imbalances. And I'll just pick up on something that Malcolm said and say that behind that there is an imbalance of policy, because if you look at the sort of three big elements of policy, fiscal, monetary, or monetary, fiscal, and structural reform, really only the monetary is working, and fiscal and structural are not providing the support that they could and should. Now, all of this is, or most of that, is not the G20's fault. The G20 is not responsible for slow, weak, and unsustainable growth, but fixing this problem and getting back to strong, sustainable, balanced growth is key to the G20's credibility. And without it, I think the G20 will fail to sustain support or even existence. I think the Australians last year did something important in getting agreement to a 2% target for increased growth, increased GDP by 2018. I think it's good to set a quantitative target like that. The action plans that they got everyone to agree to are important. Of course, as somebody said, I guess Antonio said, you know, a lot of those measures were already things underway, and that's one of the problems with this area of cooperation, which is that most of these measures depend on domestic economic policy, and each country has to make its own decisions based on its own political and economic needs about what it's going to do to support its own growth. And frankly, I think there are limits to what the G20 or any group of countries can do, even if they're well-intentioned and have the right spirit. So that's, I think, a fundamental problem in this area. And I think it leads me to thinking about, yes, we need the target, we need the action plans, but I think we need to spend more of our energy and focus on some cross-cutting issues that we can actually potentially gain from at a minimum, sharing experiences and expertise, and maybe doing some things together in policy that might liberate a little more growth. And so I think it's appropriate to focus, as the Australians did, the Russians first, the Australians, and now the Turks, on infrastructure, because that strikes me as something that that has a sort of potentially cross-cutting benefit. It affects both the supply and demand side of economies. It has an impact on development, on jobs, obviously. So it's a good issue that covers a lot of the G20 work and objectives. And so I think this is the right thing to focus on. The key is to find a few things that we can do to help stimulate greater infrastructure spending, whether from the public sector or unleashing private sector, or both together. And that's easier said than done, but that's what the focus should be this year, is finding a few little things that can help unleash a little more infrastructure spending and investment. The other one that isn't so much focused, so that's good, that's on the Turkish agenda. The other one is trade. I think trade should be a higher priority. That's for the Turks. I think trade, we've all noted that trade growth is lagging behind GDP growth, and that it's something where I think we have to cooperate on trade. We have to work together on that. And I think we should be looking for specific ways to move the trade agenda forward. I think that last year, the year before, the G20 actually made a contribution by giving a nudge to the trade facilitation agreement in the WTO. It didn't solve that problem solely, and of course there was a setback later, a few months later, but I think that's the kind of useful thing the G20 can do to give political drive and guidance to a specific issue like trade. But focus is important. Let me just say two other things. First, there are those three adjectives: strong, sustainable, balanced. Turkey seems to want to add a fourth adjective, which is inclusive growth, and I think that makes sense in the sense that that is something that people care about. And it helps to set an agenda. It shows that there is a concern about inclusivity. The problem is the word inclusive means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it isn't a very precise term. So I think, again, one needs, if you're going to add that as one of the new adjectives behind growth, I think it needs to be defined very specifically and very carefully. And I think one of the things that happened last year, again, that is a good example of what I think should be the focus this year and next is, for example, the target of increasing female participation in the workforce by 25% by 2025. I think that's a very concrete thing that sets an agenda that people can then see and understand, and then policy can be directed towards that. The SME focus of the Turks, I think, is appropriate, but again, you need to define very carefully what you're going to do to help advance SMEs. I'm less interested. I've heard about a sort of a world SME forum. I mean, I think that's fine, but I think it'd be more interesting to look at what some specific mechanisms would be that would enhance SME growth. I like financial inclusion, too. I think that's another topic that helps address this issue of inclusivity. So again, being precise. And that leads to my just final point, which is that, I mean, I very much look at the G20 glass half full. I think if we didn't have it, we would have to create it. And I think it provides a public good to the world, which is very important. And it really does three broad things, in my point, in my view, that nothing else, no other forum like it does, which is problem solving, agenda setting, and building habits of cooperation. And problem solving ranges from crisis management, where it proved itself at the beginning of its life at the leader level, to the little things that it does to solve problems. But agenda setting is also important. The problem is you need to marry the agenda setting and the problem solving in a concrete way. And I think if you don't, you end up with a credibility problem. So I think part of this is managing expectations by setting credible goals that people can see. I think of it, and this metaphor works for me, it may not for other people, but I think of it as sort of, you need to define the kind of castle on the hill that we're aiming for, we're headed towards, but then lay down some specific bricks in the road, little things that are credible, important, not easy things, but relatively small things that people can understand are directed towards that objective. And then you have to explain that we're not going to get there immediately. We're just going to do a few things that lead in that direction. So I think that's what the focus should be of the Turkish year and the Chinese year, is keeping those goals very clear and credible, but then managing expectations so that people understand we're only going to do 3 steps towards that ultimate goal, not 1,000. I think 1,000 is too many. I think we need to boil it down to a few. So that's essentially the way I would approach this, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew, and I hope that in this discussion we'll get to a little bit more clarity in some of the issues that you raised. Let me now turn to Guillermo Wiersbe of CFID. Guillermo?
Yes. Thank you for TIFAF for the invitation to speak today. I will speak first from some financial regulation topics, and then macroeconomic topics. The ruling of the New York judge Thomas Griesa against Argentina, endorsed by the Supreme Court of the United States of America, is based on an arbitrary interpretation of the pari passu clause, which contravenes the equality principle by ordering a privileged treatment to a tiny group of bondholders against the 92.4% of the creditors that had accepted the restructuring, and involve a systemic danger for the global architecture of debt restructurings. For such reasons, it is necessary that the international community decide to prevent such criminal conducts with regulations condemning them, designed to avoid courts from pronouncing erroneous, arbitrary, and biased interpretations that would allow that undermining of people's well-being, as well as regional and global stability, favoring the enrichment of a few unscrupulous speculators. In this sense, high relevance should be given to the resolution adopted in the framework of the United Nations on September 9, 2014, entitled "Towards the Establishment of a Multilateral Judicial Framework for the Sovereign Debt Restructuring Processes," which was prepared by the G77 plus China, where it was decided to elaborate and approve a multilateral judicial framework for the sovereign debt restructuring processes, with a view on, among other things, increasing the efficiency, stability, and the foreseeable nature of the international financial system, and accomplishing a sustained, inclusive, and equitable economic growth and sustainable development, in accordance with the national circumstances and priorities. The G20 cooperation and full support to this course of action, which counts with the majority approval among countries, is needed. In consequence, it is our understanding that it is essential that the proceedings of the meeting include the recommendation of such cooperation and support. In the same way, the G20 should support resolution approved in that same setting by the Human Rights Council on October 3, 2014, in which it, quotes, condemns the activity of vulture funds for the direct negative effects that the debt repayment to those funds under predatory conditions has on the capacity of governments to fulfill their human rights obligations, particularly economic, social, and cultural rights and the right to development. Another point, Basel III doesn't offer many alternatives to the use of credit ratings for analyzing risk assets. Even when countries compromise to not rely systematically on agencies' ratings, which is another step forward, truly convincing alternatives to evaluate the risk with another instrument have not been developed. In this sense, it could perhaps be convenient to move forward in the development of spheres of rational grading, which would allow to modify today's oligopoly structure of the market of rating agencies. In addition, it becomes necessary to abandon the self-regulating spirit led at Basel and adopt another in which regulations are defined to increase the weight of macroeconomic regulations at the same time that clearly stipulate the admitted and prohibited operations for international banking. The issue, another issue, the issue of the tax havens and or jurisdictions in which financial and asset property secrecy prevail becomes critical and should be reintroduced in the G20 agenda. To be accurate, it was on the first line of the agenda previous to the London meeting in 2009, and later, this crucial matter was mysteriously eliminated from the agenda until today. To reintroduce this matter in the agenda, it's necessary to tackle effectively the illicit financial flows and capital flight from emerging and developed countries to and from them, stemming both from tax evasion and avoidance, as well as from money laundering, among other crimes of global reach. Finally, in relation to the base erosion and profit shifting plan being led by mandate of the G20, to the OECD, it is necessary the G20 should firmly support the empowerment and adequate funding of the United Nations Tax Committee. Otherwise, underlying issues to the BEPS problem affecting developing countries in particular, as well as global wealth distribution, will not be addressed in the most proper conditions or will not be addressed at all. The macroeconomic topics. The slow global economic growth has been associated with even weaker employment growth in many G20 countries and also with a weak elasticity of employment GDP than in the pre-crisis stage. Hence, more stimuli than in the past, rather than less, are required to produce similar results in terms of employment and productive activity. Inflation has been dramatically reduced by OECD countries as a whole, also on account of prolonged recession. In the OECD countries in general, and to a greater extent in the United States of America, real wages have increased less than productivity, thus contributing to the acceleration of the inflation process. This behavior of real wages may be interpreted as a result of prolonged unemployment and of institutional state change that have taken place in most countries, particularly towards the end of the 80s, when many countries implemented, in varying degrees, policies aimed at the regulating and increasing flexibility in labor markets. However, the reduction neither in inflation rate nor in labor costs had any favorable impact on employment levels, and more austere fiscal policies and changes in income distribution and favorable to lower income groups tend to have an adverse impact on aggregate demand and employment. Thus, fiscal austerity policies have led to higher unemployment and stagnant real wages. These results, in turn, reinforce the deflationary and contractionary trends and articulate with the austerity policies, leading to a persistent reduction in the rate of investment, which affects both employment levels and technological progress. At the end, the labor flexibility and the regulation of labor market policies, far from producing higher levels of employment, led to unprecedented unemployment rates in the developed world and worsening of functional incomes distribution. The redistribution of income in favor of the wealthiest social groups reduce economy's propensity to spend and contribute to economic stagnation. It is worth noticing that in the Argentine case, the strengthening of labor market institutions and the abandonment of labor flexibility schemes, which had been adopted in times of neoliberalism, contribute decisively to the increase of employment and product.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. I think the point about the weak behavior of real wages is a very important one. And actually, if you add to that the fact that low interest rates mean that people have to save more for their life cycle, it's also another factor that weakens domestic demand and consumption. So it's an ongoing problem that needs to be looked at. I neglected to mention, and I'm sorry, that Paola Subaki was called away to another meeting, and that is why she is not with us up here at the front. Let me now go directly to Sergei Drobyshevsky of the Gaidar Institute. Sergei, wherever you want.
Dear friends, first of all, I'd like to thank TIPA for organizing this meeting and also for proposing us so broad and interesting program for this year. I think this is really a great step in development of the T20 outreach format, and I hope that this is also very needed really step to make it so as important as well as other outreach format, B20, C20. So we are really growing importance, and I think this is a very good process. In my presentation for this session, I'd like also speak about macroeconomic cooperation. I should say that the Brisbane Action Plan, which was adopted during the Australian presidency, was really very great success, and this was one of the most important documents adopted by G20. But it's in fact it's only one step, because in this plan countries might only their duties, their liabilities to speed up the economic growth in mid-term. At the same time, as we see from the our life, and as we see from as academicians, from our knowledge that there are a lot of problems both in short term and long term, and I think that G20 as a organization of leading economic countries should not be focused only on one point. You see that even last year, 2014, at the time of adopting the Brisbane Action Plan and the plan to stimulate economic growth, the results of 2014 were worse than they were projected. That's why, in fact, we could say that we started with a lower point than we expected to do this. And I like to attract attention to the both two other short-term and long-term objectives, which I think need more international economic cooperations, and G20 countries can contribute to. First, about the short-term risks and problems. I think that last year we, G20 countries, really paid less attention to short-term risks. For example, during Russian presidency in 2013, maybe you remember that at the first Minister of Finance and Central Bank Governors meeting in February in Moscow, there was paid a lot of attention, and there were the discussions of the issue of currency wars, exchange rate wars, and the ministers of finance and governors declared in the communique that G20 countries would not lead a war in the world currency market, and actually we saw that this declaration was not just a word, and the risks we expected at that time were not realized. Now I see two other risks which should be addressed. First is the risk of still uncoordinated and very I should say uncertain monetary policy in both economic centers of the world. We are still not aware of, we're not certain, not aware but not certain about the timing and mechanisms and results of going out of QE in the US, and we also I think are not aware a lot about how the European Central Bank will provide its QE program and how it will affect all other countries and even European economies in the case of ending QE in the US. So I think this is really a great topic to discuss and to work on within G20. And the second point is on the oil market. In 2013 and also last year, we discussed a lot about the impact of high oil prices and also volatility, but volatility around high level of oil prices on the world economy. Now the oil prices are low, but there are still a lot of volatility in the oil prices, and we see that there are also great uncertainty about the future path of oil prices. So I think that's why I think low oil prices now nobody actually consider as one of stimulus for economic growth. And I think that the issues of transparency of pricing at global energy markets, the issue of cooperation of G20 and probably with OPEC on the future energy policy is very important. As for the long-term, as for the problems of long-term development, I should say that I think I mean, not G20, but also T20, pay only few attention to the issue of secure stagnation. Actually, last year I participated in the project with Brookings University on the secure stagnation, and I showed that in that book which Brookings prepared, there was a lot of very important conclusions and recommendations actually for G20, for many countries, and also views on the reasons and consequences of secure stagnation for the global economy. So I think we need to spur up the discussion of this issue, I think, within T20, and then probably to put this issue on the as one of the main topics for our Minister of Finance and Governance, because this is also problems of inequality, problems of exhausting resources. And I think that Turkish focus on inclusive growth is one way to go closer to the issue of sectoral stagnation, but I think we need to think over and to go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey. Paula Magri is still on a plane heading for Istanbul, and so he is, though he's on the program, he's not here with us to speak. He'll probably be able to enter the conversation later in the afternoon. Let me go then directly to John Curtin of the University of Toronto. John?
Merci, cher collègue. In launching us today, Domenico reminded us that our deliberations would cover not just the substance of policy, but the process of G20 governance. And I would like to take up the second by focusing on one element of the G20 process, one that the Turkish presidency, to its immense credit, has made a top-line priority: its implementation. 2 months ago, Deputy Prime Minister Ali Babacan stated publicly, and I quote, "We will publish G20 countries' commitments on the web transparently in order to see which countries fulfill their promises." If we think that's a good idea, do we really want to wait 9 months from now until the Antalya commitments are delivered and mounted? Or should we start right here, right now, by putting the Brisbane ones up and see how well they're being implemented? I asked that question because this morning, Angel Gurria said that this year the G20 is really about implementation, and that's it. In his view, there were enough good ideas in the hopper, enough concrete commitments, that if we just implemented them, we would be better off. And Tristan, I think, knows that views may differ on how successful the Brisbane summit was. But I think there was a consensus from everyone before the Brisbane commitments were released that if they weren't implemented, then the Brisbane summit would fail. And I think we have some doubts about how well the Brisbane commitments are being implemented, and we're finishing the first quarter of the year from Brisbane to Antalya. Andreas asked a very good question. What do the people on the streets outside think about the G20? And I think we have some evidence-based claims to answer that question. A lot of them think it's just a bunch of politicians making promises that they don't or can't keep. And I think this speaks to the heart of the legitimacy of the G20, at least they should be seen to be trying to keep track of themselves in monitoring their implementation. And if they find they're falling short, or they're actually not, but it's not working, self-correct. So my proposal about implementation, I think, starts with the centerpiece of the macroeconomic agenda for the reasons Matt identified, and all those things related to growth in the global economy. And of course, to the Brisbane Action Plan, too. Now, we've got a bit of a problem, I think, with the Brisbane Action Plan because there's still some lack of clarity about what the baseline is. Now, the leaders in Brisbane, in November 2014, they said their baseline was October 2013. It was an obsolete one by the time they got to Brisbane. I don't know why, and growth has gone down since. Joe Hockey, the day before the Brisbane Summit, they said they had over 1,000 commitments. The number we heard today is 1,000. The number we heard today, yesterday, is 800. And usually reliable sources say the finance ministers are looking at, well, 800's way too many. Let's just focus on 5, maybe 10 this year. I guess they get to pick their own, and then they'll do peer review. I ask, is that good enough? And I think not. So thus, I propose the creation of a multi-stakeholder G20 accountability working group composed of members from, yes, the G20 governments themselves, yes, the relevant intergovernmental institutions, and independent experts from economics and related disciplines. Let me suggest that this accountability working group would be co-chaired by the G20 finance deputy and by the head of the Think 20, and it would be for discussion whether or not it's the current year, our Turkish friends being very busy producing the next summit, or whether it would be in the spirit of the Troika last year's, because after all, it's the Brisbane commitments that we would be monitoring the implementation of now. Their task would be to identify the commitments and how would they be interpreted, what would count as implementation or not, how should countries be scored. To report the results regularly, in the first instance to the leaders. Surely they would be the ones who would want to know whether their promises are being kept and working. Are they accomplishing the intended results? Are they doing collateral damage elsewhere? And I would go further and perhaps in the fullness of time, ask them to reflect on which of the existing cornucopia of accountability mechanisms the G20 has already employed actually work in enhancing compliance. A development group, St. Petersburg, did that help in trusting this international organization or this set to monitor this set of commitments? Does that raise compliance? So I think there's a very rich agenda. I think it's time to start. And in conclusion, let me just say, I'm being very modest. I am not asking the Turkish presidency or the G20 to do something they've never thought of or don't want to do. I think I'm offering the help of us to do what Deputy Prime Minister Ali Babakan has already promised to do. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. As a Canadian, I find myself always wondering how an Australian finance minister can have the name Joe Hockey. I thought we had a monopoly of that, and whatever the G20 may think, I just think that's inappropriate unless his middle name is Field instead of Ice. Okay, well, Mark Uzan has been studying these issues of governance in economic policy for many, many years, and I think it's appropriate that Mark winds up among these speakers. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Malcolm, and let me thank the organizer for inviting us here to this interesting think tank summit. Our think tank organized, in fact, 3 days ago, a seminar with the Central Bank of Turkey, where our question was clearly the impact of oil prices for the new macroeconomic setting and for the major member of the G20, producers and consumers. We can clearly see a major change for the redistribution of global economic wealth. But what I wanted to talk today, Domenico mentioned the issue of governance and the issue of inclusiveness, and trying to think about what can be a deliverable for the Turkish presidency, and in thinking also very forward about China, is something maybe a little arcane, but also something that can be quite interesting for the IMF. This year is really an important year because this is also the review of the SDR basket. And as you know, nothing has been made related to the progress for IMF governance, and I was trying to think about a key pro that will help thinking about the inclusions of emerging markets in that basket. So let me try maybe quickly to go back what the SDR is all about and try to make a concrete proposal here in the think tank summit. So the SDR, the special drawing right, is a reserve asset held by Central Bank of IMF members. It gives the right to call unconditionally on national currencies. The SDR was created in 1969, and the first SDR were allocated in 1970. SDR can only be issued through allocations by the IMF, requiring support of 85% of the IMF member countries. There have been 3 general allocations, which by far the biggest one in August 2009 of 161 billion, and 1 special allocations. Amar, who is with us here, has been quite instrumental on that. The IMF has made cumulative SDR allocations of SDR of $204 billion. The SDR is not a market-based asset, and its value and interest rates are not determined by market forces. The SDR was originally valued in gold in 1974 with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. It was redefined in terms of weight basket of currencies. The currency basket at the beginning contained 16 currencies and was reduced to 5 currencies in 1981, largely on the premise that the 16 currencies were not used widely in international financial market. The SDR basket inclusion guideline rests principally on the share of a country export and use of the currency in international transactions. In 2000, the IMF formalized the practice of including only currencies in the SDR basket that are freely usable. Other principles guiding the SDR valuation comprise that the currency weight should reflect their relative importance in the world trading and financial system, and that any revision in the valuation method should only occur as a result of major change in the role of currencies in the world economy. The provision of freely usable currency against SDR is an obligation of SDR holders. The obligation to exchange SDR is limited to twice the country cumulative SDR allocations. Countries using their SDR hold fewer SDRs than they had been allocated. Countries holding more SDRs than their cumulative allocations are creditor to the SDR system. So the SDR is a purely official asset. It is not a currency and doesn't constitute a liability of the IMF. The SDR can only be held by IMF countries and a few additional so-called prescribed holders, including the BIS and the European Central Bank. The IMF receives SDR in settlement of charges and to some extent repayment of credit and pay interest on creditor positions and credit in SDR. The SDR also serves as a unit of account of the IMF operations. The SDR basket is reviewed every 5 years, or earlier if circumstances are warranted. This is the year of the SDR review, and everyone is looking to see if China will be part of the basket. So, what are the links between the SDR and IMF governance? The SDR constitutes clearly a framework for shared responsibility in the functioning of the IMF. The relationship between the SDR and IMF governance is based on the notion that the SDR basket signals the importance of currencies and commitment to the IMF. Currency inclusion may therefore be used as a proxy for an exclusive or inclusive approach to mutually and participations at the IMF in the international monetary system. The notion of shared responsibilities in the international monetary system will follow by a proposal in the 1960s by the Under-Secretary of Finance, Robert Rosa, in response to concern about the stability of the system at the time. Robert Rosa suggested that the US should start accumulating currencies of other leading countries to control the supply of dollar for international liquidity requirements. He thought this would also bring other currency into mutual sharing of some of the responsibility which the international reserve system must itself carry, and to mitigate possible pressures arising from a loss of confidence in the US dollar. Rosa argued that while the other currency will not be equally capable of serving the multitude of functions required by the reserve currency, they could be complements. The approach to currency inclusions rests fundamentally on the assumptions of currency complementarity rather than substitutability. So the SDR basket enlargement will require change the principle underlying the currency SDR valuation approach. It rests on replacing the objective or constituting of a reserve asset as a substitute for the main international currencies to offer a vehicle and framework for broader currency proliferation as a complement to the main currencies. The argument for an SDR basket enlargement rests largely on different features. One, the SDR could play an important role as a catalyst toward greater currency diversification in the international monetary system. International currency diversification is seen as desirable, establish more sources of international liquidity that are more effective in responding to international liquidity demand and promoting development of local credit and capital markets. For central bank, a broader SDR basket may help increase diversification of reserve holdings and allow gaining exposure to less accessible currencies while limiting the impact of total reserve holdings. For the currency narrow SDR basket does not add value as it is really replicable in exchange markets at a very low transaction cost. The SDR has been unsuccessful in assuming a meaningful role as a reserve asset. The limited use of SDR for almost only international transactions within the IMF implied that immediate market participants of a broader basket would be minimal, if any. The arguments against enlargement of the SDR are likely to be, we need to preserve continuity of the basket. The current SDR inclusion criteria prescribed as a constituent currency need to be freely usable, which may exclude several eligible currencies, including China. The narrow basket allows simple replication and facilitate calculation of the SDR interest rate and ease of use of unit of account. So what are the next steps? The IMF Executive Board is due to review first consideration for the SDR review in May 2015 to adopt the final review during the last quarter of 2015. To affect the IMF decision, a proposal should be filed for the G20 by April, to maybe after a seminar to discuss that proposal. And in fact, you might see, today or tomorrow, that as a G20 communique, the concern of SDR basket will be including. It means that China and other countries have been putting pressure to put the SDR basket discussions on the G20 agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to all of the speakers, not only for their interesting intervention, but for sticking to the time limits I gave. I'm going to open up the discussion to the floor for comments and questions in a few moments, but I would like to emphasize some of the some really interesting issues that the speakers have raised, and see if there may be some more discussion of them up here before we go to the floor. Matthew Goodman raised this issue of infrastructure spending. You said a key thing is to stimulate infrastructure spending. What's holding it back? What can we do to stimulate it? I wonder if any of the other speakers here have a comment they'd like to make on that, or a suggestion that would help the G20 in going forward to achieve this objective. Any comments? The reason I ask it is because I think there are two elements here which do hold back infrastructure expenditure, which are aspects, they're impediments that are actually created by the authorities. One of them is that in the public expenditure accounts, depreciation is never properly included. And this is something the politicians have done because they want to build the projects but not show the public that that there's going to be a depreciation of those and that they'll have to be kept up by public expenditure that's committed over future years. And that's created a serious problem for future generations because they're going to have to undertake the restoration of public infrastructure that should have been done continuously. I think there's a major issue there. If we look at private sector infrastructure investment and its weakness, again, I think part of the problem there is uncertainties about the regulatory environment. That's not just a problem in the financial sector, but elsewhere as well. I wonder if any of the speakers have a comment on that. Yeah, Matthew, is there anything that you would like to?
No, I think I'd like to learn from the, there may be others in the room.
Well, I'll open it up to them in a second, but anything? Okay, can we open that question up to the floor? In the middle at the back there. And then...
Professor Vüsal Gasımlı, I am representing the Center for Strategic Studies under President of Azerbaijan. The global economy continues to produce far less than it would have if the crisis hadn't occurred. And there are millions of fewer jobs and the global trade growth is still too slow. While always remaining vigilant to risks and vulnerabilities, the G20 is now focusing on the future of global economy. But on the other hand, we observe new regionalism in the form of shaping new economic blocks. For example, let's say the US-led transatlantic economic bloc, Russia-led Eurasian Union, and China-led Southeast Asian bloc. Of course, South Korea, Argentina, Brazil, Turkey, as a middle powers, could tilt the balance among these major powers. But I have a question, to what extent G20 might be a common platform to coordinate all this macroprudential, fiscal, and monetary policy? Because now there is a fighting between, let's say, new regionalism and globalization. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gary? Gary Halfbauer.
Thanks very much, Chairman. I'd like to pick up on the question you raised and that Matt Goodman raised and challenge this group of eminent macroeconomists and political scientists to think about the following problem. We've had this whole drumbeat of getting ourselves all worked up in a lather about excessive public debt. And that lather has in turn created this political atmosphere that we don't have any room in fiscal policy, which I think is complete nonsense. Is complete nonsense at a time when interest rates are lower than they have ever been in recorded history. It is just amazing that we've worked ourselves into this mental framework at a time when Nestle is selling bonds at a negative interest rate, as are other corporations, as is the Swiss bank and so forth, the Swiss government. So I have a very limited suggestion to try to reframe the thinking on this, and that is to emphasize publication of numbers on the actual interest paid, not these big debt to GDP numbers, which of course are meant to scare everybody, but the actual interest paid on public debt, which is quite modest in many countries, in a way of trying to free the mind to think about, well, we could finance some infrastructure. You know, it's no big thing. We need it for all reasons that have been said. And, you know, debt is, we shouldn't worry so much about the burden of the debt. We should worry about the burden of the interest rate. And now that you can fund it for 30 years at, under 3%, it's a bargain.
Thanks very much. Amma.
So in this context of the growth conundrum that, mentioned by you, by Matthew, I want to build on what Gary just said. And that is the adequacy and rotation of global demand. I think that is a central coordination issue. And the Australian presidency sidestepped it rather deftly by focusing on structural reforms that could be agreed upon by everybody as a good thing, and by focusing on infrastructure, which had both a positive demand and supply aspects. But the fundamental issue is that the G20 does not agree amongst itself on what really to do about the adequacy of global demand. There are some in the, who believe that more can be done on the demand side, and there is on the other side, led by one very prominent country, a view that we cannot do very much about aggregate demand. And I think for this group, it's important to get to the intellectual arguments behind it. And just to put some numbers on the table, in the period after the financial crisis, the demand in the global economy came from emerging markets, especially the deficit emerging markets, to the extent that their aggregate trade deficit was higher in 2012 than the United States. So a huge shift in trade deficits there. But as the financial conditions in 2012 and 2013 got worse, these countries all ran to cut their current account deficits. Turkey, India, Brazil, South Africa, everybody cut their current account deficits. So you had a huge shrinkage in aggregate demand. Who offsets this? Certainly not Europe. Europe was running a current account surplus, a trade surplus in excess of $500 billion. So where is that rotation of demand going to come from, especially if you have this fetish about debt, as was mentioned? The IMF WEO had some very powerful numbers on what has happened to public capital as a share of GDP and what has happened to public investment across all classes of countries. In advanced economies, public investment now is 1/3 of what it used to be a decade and a half ago, less than 3%. And at a time when interest rates are so low and there's such crying need for infrastructure, it's absurd to say that all the infrastructure has to come from the private sector, especially, say, in the United States. So I think this group has to push, in my view, for much more intellectual work on that missing piece of where is the aggregate demand going to come from to get the engines of growth growing. And my personal view is US growth may look good, but if the global economy and world trade remains where it is, it'll be difficult to sustain that growth. So I think that is one part of the macro coordination where very difficult inside the room to get a G20 discourse, but the T20 could add a lot of value.
Thank you very much. Question in the second row, third from my left.
Thank you. Yes, I would like to make a couple of comments in relation to the sovereign debt restructuring that was raised by Guillermo Biersma. We think that basically a global solution should come in the form of a statutory solution in relation to sovereign debt restructuring. And sovereign debt restructuring actually is a very important issue to address at the G20, as has been said, and it has to come in a form of statutory solution instead of individual contractual solutions, because individual contractual solutions just increase the problem and do not provide a solution. In addition to that, the other consideration that should be given is that sovereign debt should be treated as, or states should be treated as sovereigns in terms of legislation. They should not be treated as private sector and in terms of as mercantile or private sectors, but instead it should be considered the complete immunity that states should have in order to take care of not creating more development problems for the indebted countries. Yes, and in relation to the infrastructure question as well, I think, or we think that also that the public and private concurrence should be addressed carefully, because it has created problems in terms of warranties being provided by states that end up being paid by states in relation to infrastructure projects, and that create more indebtedness in the future for the public sector. Although the public infrastructure should be addressed from the public sector actually, but it's the private and public relationship that should be addressed carefully.
Thank you very much. Could you please give your name and affiliation?
Veronica Grondona from Cefidar, Argentina.
Thank you, and I'll ask others to do that as well. Yes, in the third row there.
Hello, I'm Nikola Ivanovic. I already spoke, so I will not present my institute one more time. Just a brief note. Of course, austerity policy in Europe is a big problem, but there is another structural problem. And that is in Eurasia, which is the biggest mess in the world, there are two main engines, and both are extremely huge exporters, Germany and China. And in addition to that, they are not well connected. They operate in a smaller markets, free trade zone, and it's extremely dangerous to create a free trade zone around large exporter. Both China and Germany export more than 50% of their GDP, so that is unsustainable on the long run. How to solve this problem, how to connect them better, how to integrate the markets in between better, I will speak during the panel on infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Other comments at this stage? There was, Govind? Okay.
Just one quick word about this, focus on infrastructure.
You don't have to identify yourself.
Oh, Güven Sak from TEPA. No, let me identify. This is something that we are doing new. So, just a quick comment on infrastructure issue. Andres this morning was saying that, we need to be more creative, find new things. And Matt also mentioned that, there is this discussion on infrastructure, but nothing much on trade, for example. I think, and we have also discussed that, everybody is turning to these old institutions, World Bank, IMF, and the others. The infrastructure is so much discussed, under discussion, because it is one of the conclusions of the OECD and IMF studies. For plus 2% growth, those estimations, that's a modeling framework, they are saying that this public infrastructure is an important issue. There are also market reforms, I think, as structural reform, product market reforms that are mentioned, and labor market reforms are mentioned there. So there are three important issues that are discussed in the report. So I think in Brisbane, those are the issues, basically. So if you would like to, in this discussion, in T20 framework, I think we can discuss that at the very end, in tomorrow afternoon maybe, when we are discussing about what we can do for the future. Maybe we can also start going back to the basics of how these ideas, this infrastructure thing, for example, has started, and whether it is still valid. Maybe we need to do more analysis on that too. Maybe we need to do some analysis together, some comparative studies together. Maybe some trade issues might be more important in this new framework. So we shouldn't forget that infrastructure is under discussion a lot, because it is one of the results of the IMF OECD studies, in fact. I mean, not studies, a model that they have solved, or an estimation that they have made. So it might be possible to present some new angles also to this discussion. That's one thing maybe we can also do in the near future.
Thank you very much. Any comments from the people up here at the front on those issues? Okay, other comments from the floor? There was one, there's another issue that I thought was very important, which Guillermo brought up, which is the behavior of real wages, the weakness in real wages, the impact of that on growth, on consumption, and so on. I'd be very interested if there are comments from my colleagues or from the floor about whether you see that as a macroeconomic problem or an income distribution problem, and whether you have any suggestions on what should be done about it. Okay, that's a toughie, but if anybody... Oh, go ahead? Okay, please.
Global situation, I can comment on the Turkish.
Well, please do. That would be good.
I think there is a wedge. There is a kind of a divergence between productivity and the wages in this time period. So I can only talk about our data. I think Israeli data was like that too. I read a few things on that, but there is a growing wedge between productivity. Productivity is increasing in the United States too, in Turkey too, in many places, and the wages are declining basically. So it may be a structural problem related with this technological changes, technological developments, and it may be a problem that we need to tackle with more. It may be something more structural than today's, only demand management issues. We may be a problem that may, influence how we are going to fund our social security systems in the near future. So many things may depend on that. So short comment.
Thank you. Yes. Again in the second row.
Yes, I think employment is definitely a macroeconomic problem. It's not. It's one of the topics that should be included in an agenda, and in terms of the macroeconomic policies that should be addressed in relation to employment, considering that in general flexibility policies in relation to employment have tended to increase the problem, as well as the austerity policies from governments that have also increasing the problem. And that's actually, we have in Argentina a practical case. In the 90s, we have a very neoliberalistic sort of implementation or macroeconomic implementation, and the results were evident in terms of employment. That's.
Thank you. Yes, Franca.
Let me just
identify yourself.
Antonio Villafranca from SPG. Well, if I may add just one thing. Actually, nominal wages are going down, and at the same time, prices are going down. But by reading many documents, including G20 documents, the main concern seems to be low inflation or deflation, in the case, for instance, of the Eurozone, including, by the way, Germany. And the point is that governments look much more concerned by the real burden of repaying debt. So they're looking for higher inflation because they know that there is the way to escape such a huge burden in repayment of the sovereign. So I think that these two phenomena have to be linked. I mean, attention to the real salaries and attention to sovereign debt. Because it's obvious that, of course, governments pay a lot of attention on the repayment and the real repayment of their debt.
Yeah, I think the issue we were thinking of was real wages relative to productivity. So it wasn't so much in the broader deflation zone, but in its effect on the real economy. Other points. Yes, please. It's the woman in the third row.
Yeah, Mina Toxos from Chatham House, London. Yes, I think the approach that Yuvan suggested on looking at productivity and some of the technological changes and so on should be the way that one deals with income distribution problems. I mean, I think there's been too much focus on income distribution in isolation, and the solution, as if the solution is to just make everyone a bit poorer and tax the rich, etc. So I think the important thing is to look, if it is to be taken up here, is to look at the underlying structural reasons why this has happened. And in that context, and I don't have an answer to this, but no one's mentioned it, there's the cash piles of the corporate sector. You know, what happens to that? And I know there's, you know, in America there's some debate going on about that, how to get the corporate sector to invest more, incentives there, and so on. That's something, an area that perhaps should be thought about. And I don't know if there's anyone here from Japan, but I was recently looking at Japan, and they're actually, the government's going around calling up big corporations saying, raise your wages, increase wages, and so on. So there's actually quite a lot of issues there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's another point that came out here, and Sergey made it actually, where he discussed the risk of uncoordinated and uncertain timing of monetary policy normalization and the uncertainties that this would cause. Now, the view that I expressed at the beginning was very much that, you know, this is a matter that we don't know how it's going to go. Governments don't know how it's going to go. We also know that particularly in monetary policy, governments, particularly central banks, don't want to telegraph too much about what they're going to do in the future. So I guess the question, and I'd be very interested in comments on this, the question is, how much can governments really do to reduce the uncertainties created by the inevitable differentials in the way different regions are going to move to more orthodox monetary policies? That's going to be a very major factor influencing the development of financial variables during the course of this year. So it's something that may be a subject for the G20 at the time of the November meeting. Any comments about that? Yes, in the third row back there. Please identify yourself.
I'm Yusuf Işık, an economist. With your permission, I will not comment directly on this, but there's a huge amount of cash in corporations, and they keep it for various reasons. And if they could be induced to spend some of it, and the sum seems to be about $2 trillion, especially American corporations. And this is related to the tax question. It's a very sensitive question, but I think the G20 also deals with these matters. And I think for T20, it would be useful to look at unprovocative ways of making sure that corporations pay their tax and don't keep their money away for avoiding tax paying. Not all of them, but a pretty large number of them. Thank you.
Okay, very, very important point. Let's take this other.
Thank you. Igor Makarov, Asa High School of Economics, Moscow. I'd like to address the question you posed about the uncertainty, about when governments will understand how they can operate real monetary policy. I think that just now there is a fundamental factor which makes this uncertainty really fundamental for a long time, and this factor is the change in oil pricing. The problem is not only that the oil prices are low just now. The problem is that the volatility of oil prices will be long-term because the change in role of OPEC. And when some years ago, even 5 years ago, everybody understood that if oil prices will achieve, for example, $90 per barrel, it will be the challenge for Saudi Arabia budget, and it will lead to the decrease in production by OPEC, and the oil prices will be more or less stabilized. But just now, OPEC loses this role of stabilizer of oil prices, and that's why oil prices will be more and more volatile. And this factor is really fundamental, and it makes this uncertainty a real fundamental factor of monetary policy as well. Thank you.
Thank you. On this point on the point on corporate cash balances was raised twice in two different contexts. One in the context of wages, and the other in the context you raised it, which was the suggestion that somehow there was too much cash building up in corporations and maybe it should be taken away in taxes. Now, if we look at the early part of the recovery from the recession in the United States, there was a large buildup of corporate cash balances that appeared to be related to relatively high profitability. And the fact that because of uncertainties about the regulatory environment, the macro environment, et cetera, firms weren't prepared to invest. But that's sort of water under the bridge now. Now we're in a situation where what we've seen over the past year is non-financial corporations borrowing in order to buy back stock, not to increase cash balances, but to buy back stock to raise their rate of return on equity. And that is an increase in gearing, which is another element of this reach for yield, because if interest rates are increased, the cost of that debt, which is relatively short maturity, will rise. So this is another element of the reach for yield problem, it seems to me, rather than a tax or wage issue. Maybe I'm missing something in the arguments there, so I'd just like to put that out and see if there's a more sensible way of looking at it than I've put forward. Maybe there's time to think about that. There's one other element that I'd like to get back to, and that is the issue that Mark raised about the SDR. I guess there's a very interesting question here, not really, I think, so much for the G20, but for the IMFC, which of course has most of the same countries in it as the G20. And that is the role of SDR-denominated assets in the broader system. We know that a single currency reserve system tends to be unstable in the long run because of the Triffin effect, the fact that it has to run a deficit on an external liabilities basis in order to provide the liquidity that the world needs. But that raises questions about its sustainability. But we also know that multiple currency systems are very unstable in the short run, because anything that one of the reserve currencies does causes everybody to shift to another one. And so they're very unstable in the short run. Is having private sector SDR-denominated assets be more broadly used in the private financial system as a vehicle currency an answer to this? And if so, is it a policy issue, or is it something the private sector will develop on its own? I don't know if there are comments from the floor, or Mark, you'd like to comment on it. It's a very interesting issue and maybe very important in coming years. Gary? Please state your name and affiliation.
Thanks, Gary Hoffbauer. Well, my remarks are orthogonal to your question, Chairman. but this is the fundamental reality. The IMF is much too small to deal with the problems with which it is challenged. Its assets are about 500 billion, and when you look at the size of the global economy, which is about 70 trillion now, and the kind of debt magnitudes or sovereign debt problems, 500 billion doesn't cut it. The answer today, which has been evolving, is swap lines between central banks. And the central banks are not going to allow the IMF to take over their prerogative of swap lines. There may be something the G20 can do in terms of making swap lines or encouraging central banks to make swap lines more generous, longer, and so forth. But that's the reality. And talking about the SDR, I mean, I think it's like talking about Rip Van Winkle.
You're talking about a different problem, though.
Well,
You're talking about sovereign debt problems. And there's a broader issue here which also relates to the issue of, for example, how important is it for the renminbi to become convertible from the point of view of international financial transactions? We're not talking about official IMF SDR capacity to lend. We're talking about the role of a multi-currency instrument in private financial transactions.
Yeah, but I am talking about that, Chairman. RMB is becoming convertible, and as RMB, as the Chinese authorities, People's Bank, give swap lines out to other countries, which they are doing, that gets into the general chain of finance of all kinds of commercial transactions. I mean, that's what's happening. And that's what's going to happen more, not kind of some sort of resuscitation of the SDR.
Okay, that's an interesting view. Other comments on that? Okay, I think we started late. What I'd like to do is to see if there are other comments from the audience on any of the subjects we've discussed or new ones that are related. And then I'm going to give a little time for each of the panelists to make a final comment in the front here. Please state your name and affiliation.
My name is Manuel Montes. I'm with the South Center. This is about the debt issue, right? Last week, the General Assembly ad hoc committee on the resolution of the debt that Guillermo talked about had 3 days of meetings with experts, private sector people. Well, I mean, this is the reason, probably this is a good topic to bring up to the G20, right? The Turkish delegation attended. All of the Europeans didn't attend. The Americans and the Japanese and all of the Europeans didn't attend. Iceland was there, but no, I mean, the other Europeans were, Switzerland wasn't there. So it was a discussion of experts among G77 countries, basically, plus Iceland and Turkey and a few other countries. And I don't know whether, the IMF was officially invited, and the IMF officially declined to come. I mean, they were also invited to speak, and they declined to come. And I'm wondering if this is the kind of agenda, right, that, or if this is the kind of gap in global governance, right? Because this was a discussion. There is no guarantee of what will come out of this process. It might even be that the process will decide to assign the IMF a lot of responsibility, which I personally tend to believe in, right? And many of my colleagues at the South Center do. It might end up to be that way, but to some extent, this process is basically being ignored, right? And to what extent can the G20 find a way in which, basically, among the conclusions of this first meeting, there will be 3 other meetings, is to encourage the other countries to engage in this process, and to what extent can the G20 help to encourage other countries who are involved in the debt resolution issue to be involved in the debt resolution issue that is going on at the UN. Basically, this is a comment on the debt issue.
Thank you. Other comments? Yes, please.
Yes, one final comment on something you asked before in relation to the corporations having, the mention on the corporations having these accidents of which could be employed and the tax relation to it. Actually, I think the focus should be on tax havens, as was mentioned also. Yes, corporations might be showing in some countries some losses and they might be using tax havens as well in order to pass other profits and in that respect, actually, it's being discussed in the BEPS context, also the information exchange and so on, but there's still a lot of space for through tax shelters and special purpose entities that are used and that are not being and that's a problem that is not being actually addressed in the BEPS process either, and the information exchange either. So that's one of the ways in order to get actually that part of the money that can be used for government's policies.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's go back to the panel to see about final comments, maybe 2 minutes or so. Mark, there was a certain amount of difference of views about the SDR, even as a private numeraire. I wonder if you'd like to say a few words.
Very concretely, you are going to have a decision being made by the end of the year. And I think everyone knows, is it all about China? Are we going to include China in the SDR basket? If we talk to our Chinese counterparts here, this is quite important for China. China is not yet a fully usable currency. The SDR basket, before you have currencies, were not convertible. By signaling that we want to include new currencies, here I'm thinking even the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar, you can showcase to the emerging market that we're trying to do something to include them, as we have a hard time to do something in terms of IMF governance. So by having maybe new currency in the SDR basket, you provide a nice signaling device about that, we try to do a quid pro quo, making progress on the SDR basket, and hopefully waiting for having IMF, governance approval. And it would have been a good deliverable for the G20 summit in November for Turkey, giving after China taking over. That's another way also to revive the debate on the international financial architecture. There is no more working group in the G20 on the international financial architecture. Two other comments related to more the macroeconomic settings, I think that we have discussed today. I think what maybe in the insight at the end, there are two major asset prices that have a major change, the US dollar and the oil prices. How they are going to affect the world G20 membership. That's, I think, that can be very important. And I think for maybe next year China presidency, as someone said, IMF has been revising forecasts and trying to look at potential rate of growth for a lot of countries. We are seeing them going lower and lower. What is behind that? Is it like permanent secular stagnation for advanced countries? This is a problem of middle income trap for emerging markets. So that's this type of topics, I think, that are quite relevant for G20, and will bring G20 looking less on short-term economic outlook, but to more medium-term issues.
Thank you very much, Mark. Matthew Goodman, 2 minutes.
Thanks, Malcolm. And that was a very interesting set of points, and I learned a lot from listening to all of that. I do think, though, that a lot of the issues that have been talked about here get back to good, sound domestic economic policy by individual G20 members. And while I think we can shine light on sort of what those good policies are, I think in my view and my, frankly, experience working in the G20, it's going to be difficult to get the group to agree on many of the things that were talked about. I would say a couple of things that I thought were interesting for further discussion and debate when we talk about infrastructure and trade. Gary's point about publishing actual interest payments, I think that's the kind of thing that might actually be that's sort of new and different and worth maybe talking about, which could help change the debate about about whether we're really in some sort of fiscal jam that means we can't invest in infrastructure, which I agree, I think is wrong. And your points, Malcolm, certainly about the regulatory capital as potentially, if I understood your point correctly, potential constraint on private sector investment in infrastructure. That seems like something worth, since the G20 actually has contributed to that point, they may be usefully able to take a look at that as to whether they've gotten the balance wrong. Depreciation, I'm not so sure, but certainly the regulatory capital one. And then I think very first point was made about, if I understood it, regional trade agreements. In the trade area, I think that's another thing the G20 could and should talk about, trying to bring together these different approaches. I think eventually they're going to need to do that. I'm not sure any of those individual developments have matured enough for there to be a concrete discussion about how to bring it together, but ultimately the G20's got to do that and figure out how to get the conversation back in Geneva about a multilateral approach to trade. But again, we can talk more about that in trade. And then actually the tax haven point here right at the very end, I think, is the kind of thing the G20 has done work on, and the information exchange. It may not be sufficient, but I think it was an important step in the right direction. And this is the kind of stuff, all of this that I'm talking about and that I'm reinforcing here are the sorts of things the G20 could and should talk about as a group and try to come up with a sort of collective action approach. Many of the other points, I fear, while important to domestic economic policy, are going to be very difficult for the G20 to act on together.
Thank you, Matthew. John Curtin.
Yeah, it follows the point, because I think Gary's suggestion deserves a comment. And I too would sign on. I'd add a couple of other numbers. Specifically, those G20 members that have complied with their Toronto summit commitments on fiscal consolidation, that have a big infrastructure need, that can borrow very inexpensively right now and face the prospect of maybe higher interest rates soon, should do it right away. I'm persuaded by Larry Summers and others that that's a good thing to do, and maybe the G20 could encourage President Obama to raise and spread the minimum wage for macroeconomic purposes. My broader point is that we've only got one locomotive, and I think it's good enough growth from the United States. I wouldn't call it strong growth yet. So I understand the temptation of North American finance ministers to look to Europe and lecture, but I think we've got to make sure that the United States goes as fast as it can as part of a package.
Guillermo, why don't you go next?
Yes. It is proved that exists the hysteresis between the potential product and the real product. It is necessary to pay attention to increase the aggregate demand in the global economy, and to increase the global aggregate demand in the global economy is possible if we think to be against the austerity. The improvement of the income distribution and and pay attention to the public investment is necessary in this moment, because if the austerity policy continue, we will not not only be with problems in the real product, in the real actual product, we will affect the future of the real product and the real income of the people. because the real product of the future depends of the real product of the actual economy, and the real product and the potential product depends of the real product, and the real product depends of the level of the demand. The austerity is against this way of thinking, and this way of thinking is proved in many studies of economy.
Thanks very much. Sergey?
Yes. Actually, the discussion we had here even convinced me more that the issue of uncertainty in the monetary policy and coordination of monetary policy is very important. For example, the problem of unused cash balances of corporations, banks, is also a question of the future monetary policy or the future level of interest rates, because companies, banks now doesn't know what will be the price of capital in the future, and the public investments, which infrastructure investments. Well, there is no another way to finance public infrastructure investments except through public borrowing or through PPP projects. But what will be the price of such borrowings, and where we should invest, because yeah, there is a lot of uncertainty about where the future demand will concentrate and the future activity, how it will change geographically, especially because, but I understand that this is an issue of next session, especially because of new regional economic agreements and new regional economic unions, which also have their own regional investment projects, which create their own regional development banks, etc., etc. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to give a vote of thanks for a very stimulating and engaged discussion, not only to our people, our discussants at the front, but to everyone who's in this room. Thank you very much.